With each sentence, the enormity of the crime unfolded. The female students had been trafficked, exploited, and discarded. The boys were sold overseas for labor, their fates unknown. And amidst the chaos, Audrey had somehow escaped, but not unscathed. She carried scars, both visible and invisible, reminders of the horrors she'd survived. Hearing these details broke Laura and Helen anew. Rory and Sally weren't just victims of circumstance. They had been sacrificed to greed and corruption. Their deaths, though tragic, paled in comparison to the suffering inflicted on others. Yet even in the depths of despair, a flicker of hope emerged. With Audrey's testimony, the case could finally move forward. Authorities scrambled to reopen investigations, contacting international agencies to trace the trafficking ring's operations. Principal Brooks, arrested and exposed, faced charges that would ensure justice, if only partially, for the families affected. For Laura, the journey ahead remained uncertain, fraught with pain and unanswered questions. But for the first time in decades, she felt a glimmer of closure. Knowing the truth, however brutal, allowed her to honor Rory's memory in a way denial never could. As the night wore on, Laura, Helen, and Matthew stood outside the police station, watching the stars emerge one by one. They had started this day burdened by grief, but now they carried something else: purpose. Justice wouldn't come easily, nor would healing, but together they vowed to fight for the children stolen from them, to give names and stories back to those reduced to statistics. For Laura, the road ahead was daunting, but she took solace in knowing she wasn't alone. With Audrey's courage lighting the way, perhaps they could reclaim some measure of peace, not just for themselves, but for everyone touched by the tragedy. Laura stepped into the police station. Her heart raced with a mix of hope and dread. The weight of 27 years of unanswered questions pressed down on her, but for the first time, she felt like they were close to uncovering the truth. Audrey's confession had opened a door that had been sealed shut for decades. Now, sitting in the cold, sterile waiting area alongside Helen and Matthew, Laura couldn't help but replay every detail in her mind. The photograph, Principal Brooks's nervous demeanor, and the mysterious young woman who turned out to be one of the missing children. The air inside the station was tense, thick with anticipation. Officers moved quickly around them, their voices low but urgent as they coordinated efforts. Laura noticed how Helen clutched Matthew's hand tightly, her knuckles white from the strain. Matthew, usually calm and composed, looked visibly shaken. None of them had expected this day to unfold the way it had. They came here seeking closure, but what they found was something far darker and more complex than any of them could have imagined. When Officer Jensen finally emerged from the interrogation room, his expression was unreadable. He motioned for them to join him, and the three followed silently, their footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. Inside, Audrey sat at the table, her face pale but resolute. Her eyes met Laura's briefly, and in that moment, Laura saw not just fear, but also courage, a determination to face the past, no matter how painful it might be. Officer Jensen began explaining the situation, his voice steady but somber. "Principal, Lillian Brooks has confessed," he said, pausing to let the gravity of his words sink in. "She orchestrated the entire trip, framing Mr. Gregory to take the fall. She was under immense pressure, debts she couldn't pay off, loan sharks threatening her family." Laura's breath caught in her throat as he continued. The trip to Big Bend Park was never meant to happen. Instead, the bus was rerouted to a border area in Mexico, where the children were handed over to human traffickers. Each word hit like a hammer blow. shattering the fragile hope Laura had clung to for so long. The male students, sold overseas for labor. The female students, exploited and abused by criminal gangs. It was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Yet here it was, laid bare before them. Laura glanced at Helen, whose face had gone ghostly pale. Tears streamed down both their faces as the horrifying reality settled in. Audrey spoke up then, her voice trembling but clear. "I was the only one who made it out alive," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. 12 years ago, I managed to escape from the man who had bought me. But even after getting away, I was too broken to go back to my parents. That's when I connected with Principal Brooks. She helped me build a new life, paid for my apartment, covered my expenses. But in return, I had to stay silent. She said telling the truth would only add to the family's pain. As Laura sat in Helen's living room, the weight of 27 years pressed down on her like a stone. She had spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering where Rory could be. Was she alive somewhere, lost and scared? Or had she been taken by something far darker than Laura dared to imagine? The questions never stopped, but today felt different. That photograph, the one with Principal Brooks standing near the bus, wasn't just an image. It was a thread pulling at the fabric of everything Laura thought she knew. Helen watched her friend closely, seeing the storm brewing behind Laura's eyes. "You're thinking about that picture again, aren't you?" she asked gently. Laura nodded, unable to shake the feeling that this small detail might unravel years of unanswered questions. "It doesn't make sense," Laura said finally, breaking the silence. "Why would Principal Brooks lie about being there? And why does no one remember her presence clearly?" Helen sighed, her own grief mingling with concern for Laura. "I don't know," she admitted, "but chasing shadows has only hurt us before. We can't let false hope destroy what little peace we've managed to find." Despite Helen's warnings, Laura couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion gnawing at her gut. After leaving Helen's house, she found herself standing outside Principal Brooks's home, clutching the photo tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as she knocked on the door, unsure of what or who she might find inside. When the principal answered, her polite smile faltered slightly upon recognizing Laura. But it wasn't just the principal who caught Laura's attention. Standing behind her was a young woman, someone unfamiliar, yet oddly familiar all at once. There was something guarded in the way she looked at Laura, as if she were hiding something, or protecting herself from discovery. The encounter left Laura reeling. Principal Brooks's evasive answers and nervous demeanor raised more red flags than ever. Why did she seem so reluctant to discuss the trip? And who was the mysterious young woman lingering in the background? As Laura pieced together fragments of the conversation, later that evening, sitting alone in her dimly lit kitchen, she realized the truth might be closer and far more devastating than anyone imagined. Audrey Whitman. The name echoed in her mind like a ghost, haunting the edges of her memory. Hadn't there been a tombstone with that name etched into its surface? Yet here was a living, breathing person, claiming to visit the cemetery every year to grieve, but not for herself. Meanwhile, Audrey wrestled with her own demons. For years, she had lived under the shadow of guilt and fear, haunted by the faces of those she'd left behind. Principal Brooks had promised her safety in exchange for silence, helping her build a new life while ensuring the past stayed buried. But now, faced with Laura's determination and raw emotion, Audrey felt the walls closing in. Could she really keep running from the truth when others still suffered without answers? Each step toward honesty felt like walking through quicksand, pulling her deeper into memories she'd tried so hard to bury. Back at the cemetery, tensions reached a breaking point. Laura confronted Audrey, her voice trembling between desperation and anger. "Who are you?" she demanded. Pointing to the framed photograph Audrey clutched protectively. "Don't lie to me. Not today." Audrey hesitated, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." It was then that Laura noticed the resemblance. The same features captured in the faded photo of Rory's class. A chill ran down her spine as realization dawned. This wasn't just another grieving visitor. Audrey was one of them, one of the missing children. The revelation sent shockwaves through Laura, Helen, and Matthew. How many secrets had been hidden beneath layers of lies and manipulation? As they followed Audrey to the police station, the air thick with anticipation, Laura couldn't help but wonder how much worse the truth would be compared to the nightmares she'd already endured. Inside the interrogation room, Audrey began to speak, her words painting a horrifying picture of betrayal, exploitation, and loss. Principal Brooks hadn't merely neglected her duties. She had orchestrated the entire tragedy, conspiring with criminals to settle debts and save her family. The school trip had never been meant to reach Big Bend Park. Instead, it became a trap, leading innocent children into a nightmare beyond comprehension. Imagine waking up one morning, the sun barely peeking through your curtains, and realizing that today marks 27 years since you last saw your child. For Laura Callaway, this wasn't just another day. It was a milestone of pain, grief, and unanswered questions. But what if I told you that on this very day, something changed? Something small yet monumental. A detail so easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore, once noticed. This is the story of how a desperate mother's determination unraveled a mystery, buried for decades. A mystery involving an entire class of children who vanished without a trace. It all began 27 years ago, during what should have been a routine school trip. A group of young students set out full of excitement, their laughter echoing as they boarded the yellow bus that would take them away from home. None of them returned. No bodies were ever found. No solid answers came forward. The only suspect, at the time, the male teacher who accompanied them, disappeared along with the kids, leaving behind more questions than closure. Families were left shattered, their lives forever altered by the gaping hole where their loved ones used to be. And, while most people eventually moved on, or tried to, one mother never stopped searching. Laura Callaway became synonymous with resilience. Her daughter Rory had been among those missing, and every year on September 28th, Laura visited her grave, even though it held no body, just memories and endless what-ifs. She clung to hope like a lifeline, refusing to believe that her little girl was truly gone. It wasn't about denial. It was about justice, about truth. Because deep down, Laura knew there was more to the story. And then, on this particular anniversary, fate handed her a clue she couldn't ignore. A photograph hidden in plain sight, tucked inside an old album belonging to her best friend, Helen Carter. Helen, too, had lost someone that fateful day, her daughter Sally. Together, these two women shared not only friendship, but also a bond forged in unimaginable loss. As they flipped through pages filled with happier times, Laura froze. There, staring back at her from a faded photo, was Principal Lillian Brooks, standing near the same bus that took the children away. Why hadn't anyone mentioned this before? Wasn't it supposed to be just the classroom teacher and an admin staff member on that trip? That single image sent shockwaves through Laura's mind, igniting a spark of suspicion she couldn't extinguish. The presence of Principal Brooks in the picture gnawed at Laura. What did it mean? Had everyone been wrong about the details of That day, determined to find answers, Laura decided to confront the retired principal herself. Little did she know, this decision would lead her down a path fraught with secrets darker than she could have imagined. When she arrived at Lillian's house unannounced, she didn't expect to meet a mysterious young woman lingering in the background. Who was she? And why did the principal seem so nervous around her? As Laura pressed further, piecing together fragments of the past, she uncovered inconsistencies that pointed toward a conspiracy far bigger than anyone could have guessed. Each revelation brought her closer to the horrifying reality of what happened to those children, and farther from the life she thought she knew. Yet amidst the chaos, one thing remained clear. Laura wasn't going to stop until she found the truth, not for herself, but for Rory, for Sally, for every family still waiting for answers after 27 long years. But here's the twist. What Laura discovered wasn't just about betrayal or negligence. It went deeper, touching upon themes of survival, guilt, and the lengths people will go to protect themselves. One name kept surfacing: Audrey Whitman. If you've followed this case closely, you might recognize that name etched onto a tombstone in the local cemetery. Except, what if Audrey wasn't dead? What if she had been alive all this time, hiding in plain sight, carrying secrets too heavy for anyone to bear alone? This story isn't just about solving a cold case. It's about the human spirit, the relentless pursuit of justice, the weight of unresolved grief, and the courage it takes to face the unthinkable. As we dive deeper into Laura's journey, prepare yourself for revelations that will challenge everything you think you know. Because when the truth finally comes out, it won't just answer questions. It will leave you questioning humanity itself. And now, let's pause here for a moment. You're probably wondering, did Laura get the answers she sought? What role does Audrey play in all of this? And most importantly, what really happened to those children 27 years ago? Stick around, because the next chapter promises to unravel even more layers of this haunting tale. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Laura's mind reeled as she processed Audrey's words. How could someone manipulate another person so cruelly? And yet, she understood why Audrey had stayed quiet for so long. The guilt, shame, and trauma must have been suffocating. But now, sitting here, Audrey was finally breaking free of those chains. What about the others? Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Did anyone else survive? What about Rory? Audrey hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. I honestly don't know about the others, she said softly. We were mostly split up, but I remember. Rory didn't make it. She died the day of the kidnapping. An overdose. They gave her something, and it was too much for her body to handle. Sally was next. They didn't get the dosage right for her either. At those words, Laura and Helen broke down completely. Their sobs filled the room, raw and unrelenting. For 27 years, they had held on to the faintest glimmer of hope that their daughters might still be alive somewhere. Now, that hope was extinguished, replaced by an unbearable grief. Yet amidst the anguish, there was also a strange sense of relief. Knowing the truth, however devastating, allowed them to begin the process of healing. Audrey looked at them, her own tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. This is what I feared the most, that I'd cause you more pain. Principal Brooks was right about that, but Laura shook her head firmly, wiping away her tears. No, Audrey, she said, her voice steadier now. You did the right thing. Yes, this is painful, but we finally have closure. We can start healing now. The officer nodded, adding, with this new evidence, we're reopening the case. We've already contacted authorities in Mexico to pursue leads on the trafficking ring. Audrey, we recognize the immense trauma you've endured, and we won't hold you accountable for withholding information. However, given the nature of this investigation, we're offering you witness protection. It's essential now that we move forward. As they prepared to leave the station, Audrey emerged from the interview room. She looked exhausted, her face drawn and pale, but there was a lightness to her that hadn't been there before, as if a great weight had been lifted. "Thank you," she said to Laura, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing me, for helping me find the courage to come forward." Laura embraced her, feeling a deep connection to this young woman who had survived unimaginable horrors. "Thank you for telling the truth," she whispered. "You've given us all a chance at closure." Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, the first stars appearing overhead. Laura stood with Helen and Matthew in the parking lot, the weight of the day's revelations heavy upon them. Yet amidst the grief, there was also a newfound resolve. "What now?" Helen asked softly. Laura took a deep breath, looking up at the stars. "Now," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. "We honor our children's memory by making sure justice is served. And we help Audrey build a new life, the life she was denied for so long." As they drove home, Laura felt a shift within herself. The grief was still there, a constant companion after all these years, but alongside it now was a sense of purpose, a determination to see this through to the end, for Rory, for Sally, for all the children lost that day, and for Audrey, who had survived against all odds. Laura vowed to keep fighting until the full truth was known and those responsible were held accountable. The road ahead would be long and undoubtedly painful, but for the first time in 27 years, Laura felt like she was finally on the path to answers, and perhaps, eventually, to a kind of peace she had thought forever out of reach.